So much of modern feminism treats women's bodies particularly as a problem to solve.
Yeah.
You know, we can get pregnant. That's a problem in the workplace. We've got to solve that. So contraception it is. Or, you know, we have children. Right, that's a big problem in the workplace. Let's sort that out. So everything that is distinct about women is a problem to solve rather than a gift to work with, which I really think there should be a switch in how we do that. And I do see some emerging strains of feminism that are looking at women's sort of generative capacity in that sense of a gift rather than a problem now, which I think is good.
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. My name is Pierpaolo Finaldi, the CEO and publisher of the CTS, and your host for this podcast. Today I'm very pleased to be able to speak with Emily Hawkins. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you.
So Emily is a cradle Catholic, teacher, pro-life activist, and mother to 3 children. Her pro-life advocacy started at the university and has continued ever since, leading to her involvement with the Alliance of Pro-Life Students, where she currently serves as the communications director. Since becoming a mother, Emily's areas of interest have sharpened to the intersection of feminist thought and pro-life stances, with a view to how Catholicism in particular can be the binding thread between the two. So today we're going to be talking about Catholicism and feminism, what it means to be a woman, and what it's like to be a Catholic mother. So just say a few words about yourself. Were you kind of a cradle Catholic? How did your sort of faith life kind of develop and bring you to the point where you're talking about some fairly unpopular things, but with great courage?
So I'm a cradle Catholic. My mother's Catholic, and my dad was a convert from sort of fairly standard Church of England, almost nothing into Catholicism, and then my uncle also converted, and that was happening in my teen years. So growing up, I had parents who were deeply interested in the faith and who talked about it a lot, and I think that really showed me as a child that faith was something reasonable that you could talk about, and that really stuck with me. And also faith is a gift. So my parents raised us Catholic, and I have the gift of faith, so I have continued it in the tradition, which is wonderful. And I think at university I really came to faith on my own, and sort of that was when I was able to depart from it as something just that had been handed to me from my parents and something that I owned myself, because it was difficult and because I often felt like I was the only person who was really cared. I know I wasn't the only person, but it really felt like that sometimes. So at university I had the opportunity to really become solidified in my faith, and I did a lot of reading about that and talking with trusted people. So I've been Catholic for...
So was that through the chaplaincy at the university or not?
Initially it wasn't, because the chaplains, like the Catholic Society, was a little bit wishy-washy. I looked at their little website and they were very wishy-washy about moral issues. So I thought I'd rather stay Catholic and not join them. And then the next year they had a website that was clearly a new committee, and they were sort of much more robust about sort of actually defending the faith. So I thought I would go, and I made some wonderful friends and had a wonderful chaplain who was a really great mentor through those years. And I still have some of my Catholic Society friends are still friends now, which is wonderful, even though some of my course friends are no longer friends.
Right.
So it was
And did your interest in the kind of pro-life movement start there, or was that...
I think my interest in pro-life really started when I was doing my English GCSE, and you had to do a speaking project, and I thought, I think I should talk about abortion. And my dad saw me doing it, and he said, "You're going to need to have some really good information." So he gave me a stack of books and leaflets from, I think a few of them were from SPUC, and just said, you should read that. And then I read, I think basically from the minute that I read about sort of the incontrovertible biological fact of life beginning at conception, I was like, well, that is something that doesn't change, and that can't be disputed, really. People try to dispute that all the time, but it actually can't be disputed. And if that's true, then abortion is wrong, and it must be discussed. So I really felt convicted from about 15 that it needed to be talked about.
How was the reaction from your kind of fellow students?
I think a couple of students, when I did the talk, they said that I had made them think, and that was really nice. But I also think that when we're 15, we don't really think it applies to us, that kind of topic. Particularly not then, like 15 years ago, basically. It wasn't as deeply held a belief, so it was more like a niche interest,
Right.
and didn't really apply to us as 15-year-olds.
Was that in a Catholic school?
Oh no, it was a standard secular grammar school. So, but the teacher was nice about it. One student asked me one tough question about ectopic pregnancy, and I didn't know the answer. And I looked it up afterwards, and I was like, oh. And I was really thrilled to see that the church had thought about that as well. That was one of the beautiful things about being pro-life and being Catholic, was the more that I found out about pro-life work, the more I realised that Catholicism had actually been defending this for far longer than I've been alive, which was just wonderful, and so consoling to know, basically.
And when you got to university, did you find that the attitudes had kind of hardened among your
I think a little bit.
there?
I think a little bit. There was a little bit more angst. I mean, I was coming into university at kind of like the beginning of the outrage culture. So I think over the last decade, it's really gotten a lot worse. I think I was there at a fairly, we were just starting to have pro-choice motions come up in student societies and things, and student unions. And that was how I got involved, because a friend of mine had suggested if I wanted to do pro-life work, maybe I should just pray about it. And so I did. And then the next day, the union put forward a pro-choice motion. So that was my answer really, really immediately to get involved in pro-life things. So I started a campaign against that sort of motion. And I found other pro-life people who were Christian, and we put together a whole plan. And they ended up withdrawing their motion. I think because we sent them all of our work by accident. We thought we were sending it to someone on our side, and we sent it to the opposite side. And they saw that we were very organised, and that we actually also had a legal challenge should it need to happen, because it wasn't very well thought out. So they withdrew it, and off the back of that, we started a pro-life society and held events over the next year or two. And
so that doing that kind of thing has become increasingly difficult, actually, in universities, especially in the UK.
Yeah.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if we're quite at the stage where the Americans are yet, but I mean, there have been various stories together, I think, with the people from the Alliance of Pro-Life Students that have either been sort of thrown out of student societies, etc.
Yeah, we've seen sort of freshers' fairs where there's been sort of antagonistic moments and security haven't done very much. We've seen mobs outside talks. We've seen our own sort of speakers from APS going and having to be escorted by the police through screaming, chanting students. So I think, over the last decade, it's definitely the unfriendliness and the instinctual sort of pushback has really, really increased. And I think it's a real shame, because whenever I've been able to have conversations with sort of ardent pro-choice people, when you can get beyond the sloganeering, you end up having really fruitful conversations. Because I think some of the time what we're arguing about, you need to get to the deeper issue to see sort of where you agree. Because I think both pro-choice and pro-life people were reacting to something that is wrong. We're reacting to a feeling that something's not right. And the solutions put forward are completely different. But if you're able to recognise that you're both working from a common problem, I think that's a much better way forward for conversations. But it does require you can get beyond the shouting and screaming.
It's interesting. You say, so it's a reaction to something that's not right. But so what is it that you're kind of thinking of there?
So I think when I've talked about abortion in particular with young activist women, what they're really concerned about often is pregnancy. And there's a real fear around it. And there's a real fear in particular around what it does to your life.
Right.
Which is really tempting to write off as sort of super selfish, super absorbed, super millennial or Gen Z or whatever. But I think it's something to look at, because it is such a fear that they have that has almost been drummed into them by the culture. The culture doesn't really have anything good or redeeming to say about motherhood, other than like it's really hard and it's a sacrifice and you should be grateful if it happens to you. I mean, that's about as far as positive as it gets. You know, the main conversation around motherhood is that motherhood destroys you, that motherhood takes away something vital from you, that motherhood means you become a nobody. And that's something that young women will look at and think, I don't want any part of that.
It destroys your body, your looks, your spare time,
exactly.
your sleep patterns.
It takes, and then nobody thanks you for it. Why would women want to do that?
You might get a little couple of moments of kind of cuteness, and then that's it.
That doesn't seem like a good trade-off when you're young and in your 20s. It just doesn't seem like a good idea. So I really understand, and I think there's also a lot of fear around the fear-mongering around like birth and things like that, and actually like what physically pregnancy does to a body. Because it's pretty phenomenal what happens to accommodate new life, but it's always couched in very negative terms. So I really and I think as well, when you're raised to have career as your only sort of mindset rather than family, and that's like for men and women. You know, when we're in school, the only thing we ever get talked to about is what career we're going to have, what job we're going to have, how much money we're going to make. And there's never really any thought beyond that. So I wish at some point in schools we had more talks about, okay, if you want to have a family, how should you then organize your life? And the fact that you have, choices. Or if you want to pick a career that is not family friendly, what are you going to do to advocate for that to become more family friendly? So to have those kinds of conversations, I think would really encourage more, I guess, like family-friendly ideas, but it's so unfamily friendly right now that I see why people don't want any involvement with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. My wife's gone in to speak to in girls' schools on a kind of careers day about motherhood, and she said it's been kind of surprising sometimes how kind of hostile the reception has been from the girls, just simply because it just doesn't seem to be an option really that's presented to them ever positively.
Yeah. Or it's sort of like you're privileged if you get to stay home and be a mum because you have a partner who can work really hard and who can earn lots of money, but not everyone gets that. So, and there's sort of like a how dare you say that this is something women should be doing. Or that women enjoy doing, even.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we'll come back to that in a minute. I just wanted to just sort of finish off the discussion about the pro-life, especially at university, because it seems to have become such a kind of toxic subject, especially at university. I think it might have something to do with the way that it's thought of as pregnancy is something that kind of destroys your kind of career prospects. So, university being that moment in which you're kind of preparing for the future, that just seems to be kind of a huge kind of stumbling block to that. But when would you say that was the moment where things really kind of got toxic? And why might that be? I mean, I get the feeling that it's become kind of considerably worse in the last sort of few years, maybe decade or so.
I think probably with the introduction of the idea of safe spaces, which was just coming in 2014. That was very popular 2014, 2015 at university, to have this idea of a safe space where you could be protected from ideas that you didn't like, and that people had a responsibility to protect you from ideas that you found hurtful on a personal level. Because that, I think, for me, kind of signaled the death of proper conversation about things, where you can acknowledge that you don't like the idea of something, but that there is actual merit to discussing things. So a lot of the pro-choice discourse has as its basis the fact, like the idea that there is no point discussing and the only thing you should do is shout down, which just blocks conversation. So I think the idea of safe spaces really, once that took a hold, it was going to then crowd out useful discussion about more fringe issues.
And the idea that there were certain subjects that basically just don't deserve a hearing, don't deserve a platform.
Yeah. Especially because who decides those subjects as well? Like pro-life people, I mean, committed pro-life activists, there's a small number of us, but people who are actually more pro-life than pro-choice are way more numerous than people think. Most people are uncomfortable with abortion. Most people don't want to do it. Most doctors don't want to do it.
Hence why we can never show images are never shown of it.
I know, yeah, so because it protests itself.
Yeah, I mean, in your experience, because I've heard you speak about this, one of your talks online, about the kind of surprising number of people who basically kind of agree Is it just that there's certain areas like university, for example, where you'd encounter less of them, or it's just not an acceptable, or people are just, it's like the shy pro-lifer, shall we say?
Yeah, and I think it's sort of part of it. I think in England is sort of like our culture of sort of like don't rock the boat, our culture of politeness. It's sort of not very polite to bring up something that might make someone uncomfortable. And I think the idea that everyone loves someone who's had an abortion has been very, very successful, as if to love somebody means you can't say anything that would offend them. Whereas I agree, I think I love many people that have had an abortion. I think everybody probably loves someone that's had an abortion because there are so many of them in this country and it's so common. But that doesn't mean that we can't disagree with the things that the people we love do. And I think that's something really key that people have forgotten. And it's really uncomfortable to have a discussion about abortion, because actually having an opinion on it means you have to do something about it. Yeah. It's like Jesus, okay? So if you believe in Jesus, you have to change your life. So sometimes it's convenient not to. And so sometimes it's very inconvenient not to have an opinion or a conversation about abortion, because then you might have to actually do something about it.
And what's your feeling about how things are kind of the direction of travel in the UK especially? I mean, because we often, the discourse is, I think, especially in the kind of pro-life world, a lot tends to focus on America because that's kind of the biggest movement. And it seems to be making progress.
It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag kind of progress. It's more sort of like, I think in America, it's a very, very much more sharp division that's happening. So you see the different states with the further entrenchment of their views, and it's becoming very, very, very separate. So the different states are almost becoming different countries in terms of how they think about life. So I think there's great opportunity in America now that Roe is gone, for that to keep that discussion to actually keep happening. So I think that was a really, really important step. But here, I don't see a huge amount of ability for the discussion to happen. I see, we've had buffer zones come in. We had assisted suicide come through on that with the private members bill, and there hasn't been that much discussion about it. So I think we have a lot of work to do to actually talk about these kinds of issues here. But I also think sometimes in the long term, I think it'll come out okay. I think this kind of ideology has an expiration date, because you can only kill so many of your children before there's no future. That there's only you cannot continue an ideology when you don't have the children to give it to, and it's such a nihilistic ideology that children don't want it. They actually want something to live for, not just something to rail against. So I think it has an expiration date, and I think we really do see in the younger generations, we see the loneliness, we see the aimlessness, we see the deep dissatisfaction with what they've been given. So I think there's a huge opportunity there for the pro-life, and then also, for Catholicism to really just show here's the good, here is the joy, here is the future that you've been seeking, here is the joy that satisfies. So I think there's opportunities in the messiness.
Yeah. I'm interested that you bring up the kind of euthanasia bill. Could you make a bit more explicit what the connections are between?
I think if you have a society where for every 3 children born, 1 is killed through abortion, as in England, based on the statistics, euthanasia is inevitable, because you already don't care about life, and you particularly don't care about disabled life, and you are very keen on not being a burden. So many childbearing choices in terms of abortion or repeat abortions, so nearly 40% of our abortions are repeat, are to do with sort of not wanting to feel like a burden, not feeling like you have enough, and not feeling like you have enough support as well. And so there's a huge sort of culture of autonomy, which doesn't really work with family life. And that says that you are only worth anything if you can be an autonomous individual and you can provide for yourself and you don't need anybody else. And if you try and do that as a parent, you'll be unhappy. And if you try and do that as a young adult, you can do it maybe between the ages of 18 and 25, and then after that, it's a bit downhill. So I think if you have like the viewpoint that creates widespread abortion, inevitably leads to euthanasia. I was talking with students about this earlier in the month, and by the time you're having a conversation about whether or not you should make euthanasia legal, it's almost already too late. By the time people are seriously saying things like, "Oh well, feeling like a burden is a reasonable reason for choosing assisted suicide," as one of the MPs did say, it's almost sort of, it has to play itself out. So, I don't know if that explains it.
No.
But
so I think it's a good moment maybe to move on to the other subject I really wanted to speak with you about. I think really regarding where we are with the kind of feminist movement, which I think is really kind of fracturing at the moment in many ways, and is in a sense having to make it, or having to speak in some way to various movements in the world that are kind of questioning some of the real fundamentals of feminism as it was in its kind of original incarnation, should we say, looking for equal rights for women in work and in politics and stuff. So I don't know whether you could give us a little kind of picture of where you think we're at the moment, and maybe say something about our reaction as Catholics in particular. I think many would sort of say that Catholicism has a particular relationship with the female sex, which is sort of complex and difficult to describe. But there you go, a small subject for you to approach there.
And I think also, as far back as 2014, in my drafts on my computer, I have a draft of an article that's basically sort of why Catholicism is the only place I feel safe as a woman, or the only place I feel accepted as a woman. So I think feminism is so interesting because I would probably say it's still needed in society today, because I still see fractures, and I still see difficulties in accepting what women are and what women can do and what women have as their, I don't know, destiny. I don't.
And John Paul II talked about the sort of feminine genius, but there's a kind of.
But it was still loads of, whenever I've studied the letter to women and things with other women, we're all like, but what does that mean? And what does it practically mean when John Paul II says women belong in every sphere of society? We all listen to that and we're like, yes, we belong in every sphere of society. But, it seems like lots of the goals of feminism that we have gained have been good things. And at the same time, they have exposed difficulties. So, for example, women in the workplace. So, women can work, and women, by I mean have the capacity, not are allowed. So, we have a rational soul, and at the same time, the workplace, particularly I think the modern workplace, in lots of ways, is very oriented towards the male way of being. So in order to be a successful woman in the workplace, often you have to you have to fit yourself into the male way of being in order to be successful in that space. So I really think when John Paul II talks about women being needed in every sphere, he means being needed as women, not as women trying to make themselves fit into the male space, which is going to cause disruption if it happens properly, and it might make things a little bit less efficient, and it might mean sort of taking a step back from super numerically oriented goals of how much money you make and how and more person related goals. So I think there needs to be a balance. So I think some places in the workplace can be too focused towards the sort of the numerical goals and less focused on the person. And obviously you can have places that are too focused on the person, and that's where you get sort of HR disasters and over micromanagement and things like that. So it's always a spectrum, but I do think men and women can balance each other out in their different sort of capacities. And I think women have a lot to gift the world. And I think that we're still having that conversation. I think it's a good thing to have the conversation. And I'm glad that there are opportunities to have it. But I think it's still needed. So I still think feminism is sort of more needed. But I also think that feminism is like a really hard word, because most people think feminist and they think sort of you're angry pro-choice activist shouting, obscenities at somebody. And that's what we see, and I think that anger there is not a very useful thing to latch onto. But I think that there is room for a Catholic feminism, and I think that it is more of an embodied kind of feminism, because I think lots of the feminism that we've had so far has been very much focused on women can work, women have the same dignity as men, women can do all of the things that men can do, which I still think is quite male focused. I feel like if sort of your only goal is for women to be able to do everything that men do, it sort of treats men as superior still, which I don't think is the case. I think we are equal under God.
Something to aim at.
It's like we're not something to aim at. Like we both should be aiming at God. It should be a triangle going up to God, not women going across to men, or the other way. So, and I found that Catholicism really has more to say in that area that's actually positive about women, rather than treating women as a problem. So much of modern feminism treats women's bodies particularly as a problem to solve.
Yeah.
We can get pregnant. That's a problem in the workplace. We've got to solve that. So contraception it is. Or, we have children. Right, that's a big problem in the workplace. Let's sort that out. So everything that is distinct about women is a problem to solve, rather than a gift to work with, which I really think there should be a switch in how we do that. And I do see some emerging strains of feminism that are looking at women's sort of generative capacity in that sense of a gift rather than a problem now, which I think is good.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discourse at the moment about the problems in the world, collapsing birth rates, and that's often been it's often been kind of blamed in a sense on those problems that you've kind of brought up, and especially whether child rearing can happen in a society where most women have to go to work to support their families or the lifestyle that they want. And I think it's interesting to look at even early feminist theorists recognized that there was always going to be an issue when it came to kind of motherhood in particular. And I think isn't it Simone de Beauvoir said, we kind of have to take that option off the table for women, especially to kind of stay at home and look after their children, because there'll always be some who take that option.
Yes.
And people like Mary Harrington, who is a very interesting writer and speaker on these things, says that contemporary feminism in particular has a motherhood-shaped hole in it. So do you agree with that? And kind of what does that mean to you as a mother of three?
Yeah, I think it's a real blind spot in feminism, because like much of modern feminism is about the woman as an individual, and I think like we exist in relation to the other. That's how we exist as human beings. So independence is a lie. Interdependence should really be the goal, and how to live interdependently, I think, is a much more suitable goal for human flourishing. And I think the mother-shaped hole is what you get when women like myself become mothers, late 20s, early 30s, and you kind of realize sort of that this relationship is precious, and this relationship is like nothing you've ever had before, and this relationship changes you forever moving forward. Like, there's no going back after you become a mum. There's no sort of like getting your body back, getting your mind back. It's almost like a metamorphosis, everything is sort of ground down, and then you have this opportunity of sort of creation with your child. So one of my favorite reflections about motherhood is, when you're going to the labor ward or you're giving birth, you're not just waiting to meet your child, you're also going to sort of meet yourself as a mother to this child. You know, that relationship is about you as well. So I think something that feminism doesn't like about motherhood is that there is no mother without a child. There is no mother without another. So you can't actually talk about just the mother. You have to talk about both of them at the same time. And that's also what's tricky with abortion, because abortion tries to treat them as separate entities when actually the mother-child dyad is so sort of inseparable. But I think, feminism doesn't really, at the moment, have an answer for how mothers are supposed to or can interact in the world properly. And I think they just see it as you have to retreat from the world, or you don't become your own person anymore. Whereas actually this relationship is something that teaches us something true and beautiful about actual humanity. And also I think about God. You know, God exists in relation. That's the Trinity. The Trinity is a relational thing. And I think, you know, having children is one of the closest I've come to sort of realizing the strength of love that binds. Not saying you can't do it without children, just that my personal story has been to understand it that way.
And it has been for the majority of people throughout history.
Yeah.
That always seems to
like
be
everybody has a mother, you know, and I think to forget that or to pretend that doesn't matter, or that's something that's less than, I think is really, really anti-woman, because I think if we treated motherhood more as a fact, you know, for most women in our lives, then that would be then we would be much more encouraged to organize life around that fact. And I think we've got ourselves into a very interesting situation where motherhood is no longer a fact because of contraception. Yeah. So motherhood is now a very, very optional thing that really you only do if you're a little bit crazy. So I took the 3 children, who are 5, 3, and 1, and our dog for a walk, and someone told me, you must either be very loving or very crazy. And I get those kind of comments a lot when I'm out and about. And I don't even have very many children by my consideration. You know, I just have 3. So, but that's a lot to people now. And the only thing we can say about it in modern culture is you must be a little bit crazy, because why would you choose that? You know, but for me as a Catholic, it's a fact of my life. Like, I always knew growing up, I was never broody. I was never sort of like, oh, I can't wait to have children. I have friends that can't wait to have children, or couldn't wait to have children. I always knew they were going to be like the mumsiest of mums. That was never really my personality. But I knew that it was going to be a fact of my life because I knew I wanted to get married. So I think, you know, being a bit more accepting motherhood as a fact of life helps you to then organise life a bit more, particularly around it.
Yeah, because I sometimes I get the feeling that the way that the modern world speaks about women and motherhood is that ideally, if you could just sort of separate the two off completely and, you know, have children, you know, in a test tube and then sort of send them off to nursery as soon as they were born, that would be the ideal thing, because that would leave the woman to kind of be completely independent.
Be her own independent self.
Exactly.
Yeah, and like you see that with like the government's main response to women in the workplace is to provide more childcare, endless hours of more and more childcare, that is never even going to encourage as many women back into work as you know, to pay the taxes, to pay for the childcare. Like, it's a black hole, and for what? And most women don't even want the childcare. Most women would rather be at home. So I think it's something like 20% of women want to be more in the workplace, and 20% of women want to just be at home. But the other 60% want to most of them want to work a little bit less so they can be more at home. And most of them want to do a little bit of paid work. But that's 80% of women who'd rather be at home or doing less work than currently, so that they can spend the early years, particularly with their children.
And the response is the opposite.
And the response is, just have some more childcare by people that don't know your child in the same way. I'm sure, like, so many childcare providers are lovely, and they work really hard, and they really care about the children, but they are not the mother.
Yeah.
And also what it means is that mothers are not being given the opportunity to learn the practice of motherhood. And I think that's as well something we take on as an idea, that motherhood is this sort of we mythologize it. You know, it's just this instinctual thing that everyone, if you're a mother, if you become a mum and you're not good at it, that means that you were never meant to be a mum, and just ship them off. But motherhood is actually a practice. It's actually a skill, and it's something you learn. And I think because not many of us anymore have actually seen the practice of motherhood. Lots of us had mothers who went to work. I didn't in my early years. My mother was able to stay at home, and so I did see lots of motherhood practices that I have been drawing on as I come through. But we've lost lots of that in our culture. So we've lost a lot of received wisdom about motherhood that treats it as a skill. And I think, which it's a self-fulfilling, vicious cycle. You think it's something that you should have innately. You have a child, it's difficult, so you think maybe you should just go back to the workplace, which is what you've trained for your whole life instead, and then you go back there and then you feel like you're doing something right. But to really sort of, I think, open motherhood back up again to the idea that it's a learned thing, it's a communal thing, it's a relationship-based thing, I think would improve so many lives. I think it would improve a lot of women's lives, and it's particularly in my experience, when mothers are able to get together and talk, it's something that's really precious to be able to do that, and helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, because one of the things that I've kind of noticed, sort of observing my wife become a mother and bringing up our we've got seven children, is that you do see sometimes the motherhood being kind of technicalized, being turned into a kind of a career almost, with a bunch of books and techniques and stuff, and all those instincts and things that were learned, the wisdom of the past have been lost in a sense because of that.
And there's a sense that you shouldn't trust yourself as a mother because that's emotional,
right.
And we don't trust emotion, and you should just defer to the experts at all times, who really, lots of the experts really only have one or two children. So I read books about sleep sometimes that, like, this person had 2 children, and I'm sure this method worked for their 2 children, but my children are different. So I can't take the advice because it's not about my children. So so the culture of the expert, I think, has been quite harmful to women, in particular, mothers.
Yeah.
So
the other thing that I think that in a sense has been lost is that sense of the kind of the real respect and high status of the mother, which is something that I think in Catholicism has always been quite high. And as that gets lost, we suddenly end up in a situation where Catholicism can come across, or from the outside looks as though it doesn't really have a place for women. Whereas what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I remember at school one time we were talking in English about possibly feminism, and someone had made a comment about how there are no, like, strong women in religion, and there are no strong women in like fairy tales and things. And I grew up on proper fairy tales and, like, proper saints and everything. And I remember saying, like, well, what about Mary? And one of the other students said, oh, like, she just had a baby. That's all she did. And I was like, I couldn't believe it, because I couldn't, like, it was such a, I was like, and, like, having a baby is really important. Like, it's such an important thing. Like what she did was really, really important. And the fact that she said yes to it, and that it was hard, and, she existed within her culture. She knew what saying yes meant, and she said it anyway, and, brought about the salvation of the world. Like, isn't that amazing? That is such a good thing to have done. And for it to be treated sort of a bit like standoffishly, which I think is where Catholicism and how we understand Mary is such an important part of how we understand women. And I think, our Protestant brothers and sisters, they miss something when they denigrate Mary, and they really miss an opportunity to see the redemption of womankind and mankind through women. So especially with all the parallels with Eve, so just as, Mary, like, loosed the knot of Eve's disobedience. So Mary has all these parallels to Eve, and in a redemptive way, which is so important because the body is so important, right? And so, if you don't have Mary, you just have Jesus, who's the perfect man, and there's no sort of redemption of the female body. So women kind of stay in your theology as just the people that brought sin into the world. And that, I think that's really damaging. So I've always found Catholicism, with the insistence on Mary, sort of, she's worthy of our admiration. And I found that a really comforting thing. And then particularly as I became a mother, and then also just all of our wonderful female saints of all different types of personalities, because it's also tempting when you're thinking about the good of motherhood to be quite prescriptive about how a woman should behave and how a woman should be. But I think with the history of the saints, we can see these are all women who have achieved heaven, and some of them are sort of angrier, some of them are quite hostile, some of them are, really sort of like the modern equivalent of a boss babe, and some of them are really soft and really sort of traditionally feminine, and there's just a whole spectrum of being in the saints, which I think was important for me as a child growing up and seeing all of that and seeing that strength and dignity in lots of different ways, that you could be strong and be gentle, that you didn't have to sort of have masculine authority in order to be a powerful figure. I think that was really important. And I think that's also something that feminism misses. We see authority, modern day, as purely holding official status, official power, whereas authority in the Catholic tradition is actually slightly different. We have, the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. So we have a different view of what it means to have authority, and so I think on some level Catholicism will never look.
Yeah, that kind of indirect influence that Mary has over Christ himself.
Like the wedding feast at Cana, which is the model of how we pray. When people say, "Oh, you pray to Mary," it's like, no. It's actually biblical. We ask Mary for something, she goes and tells Jesus, and he does it. So it's exactly what happened at the wedding feast of Cana.
Not yet, and then
she goes, go on then. So I think it's such a lovely model, and I think it's really important, and it also recognizes the influence of women in society. Like, women are hugely influential in society. Mary Harrington likes to point out, for all the people that say women shouldn't vote, she was like, well, how did women get the vote in the first place? Without having the vote, they influenced society, and so we will keep influencing society. And that is sort of one of the things that is particularly sort of often in the women's sphere, because of we're a bit more relational, I would say, overall in the way that we exist. So
and that kind of incredible respect and prestige given to Our Lady and to the female saints within Catholicism kind of recognises an importance which is kind of different. It's a different role to that of the hierarchy of the priests and so in a sense, we've ended up carrying over the same problem that we have, for example, within the workplace that you mentioned, that women have to in some way kind of become more like men. So if you want women to be equal in Catholicism, then they have to start taking on some of the roles that have traditionally been for men, like the priesthood. Otherwise they're just lay people, and this word "just" I think is quite important. My wife always says, you go to the playroom, I'm just a stay-at-home mum.
I even had a young woman tell me, "Oh, I actually just want to be a mum," and I was like, "Well, I'm a mother, and there is nothing just about what I do all day, okay?" So, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I didn't mean it." And this is someone who genuinely sees the value in motherhood, and it's so automatic to say just about motherhood. I think Catholicism has a lot to say, and I think the area of authority and what do we mean by that is really, really interesting to explore, because Catholicism has that nuance in it, and it has, in Genesis, when man and woman are made, and it's good. Like, man is made by himself, and it is not good. That is when God says this is not good. So it's not good for man to be alone. And so then, from Adam, he then makes man and woman, and then he says it's very good. So that's actually the point, I think. One of the big points to draw out about equality in Genesis is that men and women together are good. So they are both good, and they both image God. So man, in his image, he created them, man and woman. And there is something about womanhood that images God, and there is something about manhood that images God. It's very easy for us to sort of latch onto all the things about manhood that image God, and I think there's a space to look at in terms of what about womanhood images God, in terms of, I think also in terms of like authority and things like that. I think Catholicism has just a lot to say that includes women and that doesn't try and treat women as men, and that doesn't try and say, like, flatten women down into a particular mould, which I found really gratifying, particularly as a mother. And I think as well, Catholicism has a lot to say in terms of family life. So I found like Humanae Vitae really beautiful and so far ahead of its time. And I think it displays such a level of care towards women in particular that is completely missed. It's really, really missed. So I think so much of the conversation around natural family planning is about sort of contraceptive mindset and everything like that. But one of the core things is that the church recognizes that women are people, and the church recognizes that we matter, like a mother matters, and your well-being matters, and the family life hinges on the well-being of your wife. So for that to be sort of something that the church really cares about has been a huge source of joy for me, and a huge sort of, it kind of gets rid of resentment, you know, to be able to know that actually the church has documents and it has books and it has, you know, history of conversations all about how sort of these very normal things about women are important and good, and things that mean we should create space to take care of women in that way.
Yeah, and
So,
I mean, also, I suppose in a sense, the big kind of problem that has ended up happening, and you see it very much in the kind of online discourse, and is that there's the kind of enmity placed between men and women. And I mean, this is not saying anything, you know, original. I mean, you know, the enmity placed between the man and the woman kind of goes from
Back to the garden.
Back to the garden, exactly.
Yeah.
And in a sense, when the church speaks, it sort of tries to speak, for example, in Humanae Vitae about the couple. You know, that this is a joint project. It's not a kind of pitched battle. I always love that. Was it the battle of the sexes will never be won because there's too much fraternizing with the enemy?
Yeah.
You know, in the sense that it is a joint project, and I think that's really what we need to kind of break down more than anything else. I don't know if that's been your experience.
I do see that. I see that a lot with you see like the feminist discourse. Sometimes it gets quite increasingly like anti-male, you know, like there's nothing redeeming about men just hate women, it's really depressing to be a woman because nobody likes us, and then you see the opposite of the male sphere just being sort of, again, anti-women and sort of just really antagonistic or really dismissive, or really sort of like women are only good for this, and this, while treating the this, and this as really lowly occupations, you know? So, and I think, yeah, the correct response is always, I think for me, I think it always comes back to the incarnation and how matter matters, and getting off the online sphere.
Right.
Because I think online's so unhelpful.
Yeah.
And I also think that like women spend a lot more online, a lot more time online sometimes than men, in certain ways, in terms of like the reading about things online. So, because I was talking to my husband about something I'd read online that really bothered me, and he sort of looked at it and he was like, yeah, well, this guy's online for a reason. Right. He doesn't have a life, so he's online. And I was like, oh, okay. Because, I mean, you know, and so many good sort of Catholic men that I know, they would never participate in that kind of discourse, and it seems foreign to them, and they would just ignore it because they think it's so stupid. But I think sometimes when you're a Catholic woman and you're quite online, it gets quite worrying reading that kind of thing, because you hope it doesn't filter out into reality, as lots of other online things have done. So I think like there's like a anti-woman pushback that comes through, and I think one of the things to be careful
sort of
of,
Andrew Tate's kind of manosphere.
That's kind of, I think, gets a bit co-opted sometimes by sort of theological like overlays on top of it, which I think is, I think if you're not looking very deeply at it, it does fit. sort of thinking about it, right? Like if you've grown up sort of with like a nasty background in like hardcore pornography and like the subjugation of women through everything, and then you have sort of like a moment where you sort of find faith, that sort of conditioning is really hard to undo. That's really hard to sort of like grapple with, and it's really quite easy to slip then straight into sort of like the sort of some of the submission things that are just women. Sort of women are only good for motherhood and children, and nothing to do with education, nothing to do with their minds, because they're not rational people. Like, so it's quite easy to slip into that, I think, if that's been your whole background. So, I mean, it's still not true. But you're
talking about the sort of trad wife kind of
a little bit
backlash,
a little
at
bit
least from the male side.
Yeah, I think a little bit. I think it's still very niche, that sort of that sort of whole idea. But I think it's worth keeping an eye on, and I think it's worth sort of like a faithful men and women having conversations about it, and so that you can identify the error, and so that you can sort of identify it and say that's not true, and we know that's not true, and that's not how we live.
So I suppose the danger is the kind of pendulum sort of swinging back too far, at least in terms of people who
and it just creates enmity again, like it just and you know, because I think it just fuels feminist rage against men when they see things like that happening in backlash to things that they've said. You know, it just creates this nasty cycle. Whereas I found the most joy in getting offline. You know, so I quit Instagram earlier in the year, and I used to have lots of lovely conversations on Instagram with lots of great women. And so to fill that void, I hosted an in-person mums meetup where we went through John Paul II's letter to women. And it was a great time. It was sort of one of my like highlights of my year to do something like that. And at the same time, I was doing some teaching for an online course on Jesus Christ, and the incarnation is obviously a huge part of that. And it really sort of hit home to me that sort of like the incarnation is really, 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 really important. You know, like God became man, and that's one of the best things ever. And it is so important, and it's
the hinge moment of history.
It's the hinge moment of history.
That's why I think we lose sometimes.
Yeah, exactly, we lose it, and I think you can get too stuck up into the whole sort of philosophical online world and not do enough living through, you know, working through that, actually living and being in real relation to people, not just in online relation to people. So I think one of the great solvers of sort of the enmity is actual relation, in-person actual relation, because it's hard to hate someone that you've had dinner with.
No, and I mean, how do you? I mean, you teach, you deal with students. I mean, do you see maybe things kind of changing? Do you see kind of signs of hope that maybe we're going away from that enmity, away from that kind of very? I see
opportunities for hope.
Yeah.
You know, because everybody like
the sort of the pre-hope.
Yeah. I see opportunities for it, but I think it's down to people making those opportunities a reality. So I think it's not just. So like for me, it's not just enough for me to know that the enmity is a bad thing. I should be doing something in my life that actually helps to stop that cycle. So like what? So not talking badly about my husband to other people, keeping our disagreements to just us. You know, not gossiping. So all of those things that damage relation, to sort of try and not do those popular things. But also in terms of, like, you can do it about men and women, and then you can also do it about mothers and children. Don't engage in poor conversation about children. Don't engage in in those kind of jokes about how children are so rubbish and terrible and et cetera, et cetera.
Ruin your life.
So ruin your life and things, and just and be a little bit more joy focused. At the same time as recognizing things are hard, you know, I think, but again, which is what Catholicism does really well, is that the secret source of joy is sorrow, and the cross is the source of our joy. So I think Catholicism has a wonderful way through suffering that is actually very helpful and doesn't just cover it up with this mask of joy. So I think in terms of opportunities for joy and for like hope, I think there are plenty, because I think we are at a moment where people are really fed up. And I also, like, there's a lot of despair, which I think is also a root cause of abortion and euthanasia, because we do have a lot of material good in this society. We live far more comfortably than our ancestors ever did, and yet we're having fewer children. So I don't think it's purely material. I think there is a level of despair, and despair doesn't make you want to bring children into the world. So, but I think in that is a really wonderful opportunity to showcase joy, because there's a lot of joy in the faith, and there's a lot of joy in the family.
One question that I always that I kind of think about a lot is that, can you have it all? Can you work? Can you be a mum? Can you run a family? Can you run a sex? Can you do all these things all together? Is it possible to have it all?
No, I don't think so. But I don't think men can either.
Right.
I think it's an unfair question to ask of women to have it all the time.
Yeah.
Because no human can. So it's not a women specific question, and I think it creates women just really beat themselves up about it all the time, about having it all, because it's been a really unfair promise. So no, you can't. You can have lots of it, and you can have all of it over your life, probably.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's not enough hours in the day, and you just have to make choices.
Yeah.
So.
No, I totally agree. And also, I think you don't have to. I think sometimes people kind of segment their life. They say, okay, this is the moment when there'll be kids, and we'll just sort of white knuckle it through that, and then on to the next thing.
Yes,
Whereas
I see that.
I mean, we've had small children in the house for 25 years or something, and we've just thought, well, we can't really white knuckle it through 25 years.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
you might as well just try and do as much as you can.
I've seen that a lot. So lots of people now are talking about how, like, your children really need you in the first 3 years of your life, and you can just do it as a mother. You can just get through it. And it's like, well, I might have little children in my life for at least another 10 years. So I can't just white knuckle it. So I have to find a way forward that doesn't involve just gritting my teeth and actually trying to make my life sustainable in a way that, family life is enjoyable for everyone. Because it's not just like a short phase, because you can't, like, we don't turn our fertility on or off. It's it's on until the end. So yeah.
And I mean, maybe just to finish off, one thing that I'm always interested in, there are these movements, even within the, bringing your whole self to work and all those kind of things, and yet so often you see, particularly with women, it's like bring your whole self apart from your fertility, apart from your motherhood, all these things. Whereas I mean, I'm the father of 5 daughters, so I've got absolutely loads of girls around the house all the time, and I do sometimes just see what an amazing, the potential in a woman just seems like so obvious. It seems so much greater and more obvious than in the male, and that in a sense is something to wonder at. And yet it seems to be the thing that the contraceptive
you have to squash down, yeah. And I really do sometimes think, like, what would society look like if it really welcomed women as they are? Because there's a pro-choice talking point that says, like, if men could get pregnant, you'd have an abortion center on every street corner. But I don't think that's the case. I actually think, that if that was something that men did, then there would be a bit more accommodation in society for family life. I actually don't think the response would be to harm, because I think the response would be to sort of like to make the space. So I really think that to exist as a woman in the world, like, there's so much, and sometimes it's just to ask permission and to know that you can ask permission to do it. So to say to your like my workplace, when I was saying how I needed to schedule my time differently because I was going to have a breastfeeding baby, my boss was sort of like, oh, well, because it's online, you can just push the camera up. And his response was really lovely to me, because it was very accepting of the fact that a baby would be present. Not sort of like, oh, well, I'm sure we could provide some childcare for you. It was very sort of like, you can have the baby and do the work, and I don't think that your mind works less because you have the child. I don't think that you're a lesser thinking person because of that. So those kinds of opportunities and those kinds of conversations, people are really ready to have them. I think we're at a nice point in
I think maybe one of the few good things that came out of the whole COVID crisis was that.
Was that a potential for that?
Yeah.
And I think as well, like we also live in, I think what people term quite a knowledge economy. And that's something that's very useful for motherhood in particular, to be able to participate in that rather than having to go do some physical work, because that's very hard to do outside the home. Yeah. So there's so many opportunities now for work inside the home. And you know, men in the workplace, they're allowed to be much more flexible now. So I see so many more fathers requesting sort of part-time hours or flexible hours or accommodations for being the person to sort of pick their children up from school and that kind of things. And I see sort of much more of a culture of that. So I think if we could keep that rolling and to keep on having those what's actually useful for parents and families in terms of work, and try to make work fit for families rather than families fit for work, then I think that would be a lovely step forward.
Yeah, that's I think a great thing, a great sign of hope on which to end. So, Emily, where can people follow your work? We've got a book that you wrote a few years ago about the pro-life march.
Yes. My friend Emily, who's also called Emily, she put us forward to write this book, and it was a really fun project with her. So I'm glad we did it. My children actually love reading it. They love seeing the little illustrations, and every time I've been pregnant, they've been like, "Look at the book." So that's been lovely.
That was published with the Catholic Mothers Apostolate, run by my own wife.
That's that's really where you can find it. Kiara's wonderful.
And a definite example, all of you, of how much you can do together with motherhood.
Yeah.
Balancing it all in a beautiful way. So thank you so much, Emily, and it's been wonderful to speak with you.
Thanks.